All right.
Hour is 2 o'clock, so if you're ready, Dr. Wright, I'll introduce you and we can get started.
All right, that sounds great.
So, everybody, welcome to the first activity and seminar for the Pop Culture Ideas Lab for the 2024 academic year. Glad to have you with us online, and those of you that are joining us for our first hybrid program. It is my honor to introduce one of my colleagues, Dr. Kevin Wright, who of course specializes in health communication, also social media, interpersonal relationships, PhD from the University of Oklahoma. But we are privileged today to have Dr. Wright speak to us about something that is off-brand for him in that space of communication, but something that he still has a strong passion for, and the idea of music, and especially the intersection of mainstream popular music and how it relates to African-American populations and marginalized groups in general. So with that being said, Dr. Kevin Wright.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's fun to wear a different hat. I'm usually wearing the social science, health communication hat, but today I get to talk a little bit about popular culture and taking more of a critical theory type of lens, looking at the whole idea of bluegrass and country music. And so I'll talk a little bit about it. I think one of the things you'll find interesting is that the history of the banjo, which today I'm not going to just talk about as an instrument, but also as a popular culture text. The history of the banjo really parallels African-American history, which I'll get into in my talk. But I'm just going to do the slide here for a second and just ask this question. I'll play a little bit, and then I'll start talking. All right, thank you very much. I'm going to switch over to talking mode here instead of playing mode. All right, so I asked the question here, what's kind of the, second. I asked the question, where does the banjo come from? Anybody in the room, what is your answer to that? Oh, no, like, where do you think the banjo originated?
The chorus from West Africa.
Woohoo! All right, you got it right. You can, yes, a lot of people will tell me when I ask that question, they'll say, oh, Appalachia, right? And so they're only off by 4,300 miles or so, because really the banjo came from West Africa. And so really, it's interesting. One of the reasons I like talking about uh, bluegrass music and country music from a pop culture perspective is you're really having to pull back the curtain, right? A lot of people forget that the banjo actually came from Africa. So it made its way to America through the slave trade in the 17th and 18th centuries. It is often called the first American musical instrument. So not only is it an instrument, but it's also a symbol. So today when I talk about bringing the pop culture lens, I'm going to talk a lot about John Fisk's work and the idea that anything can really be a text, a pop cultural text, including a banjo. It's often a symbol of bluegrass and country music, but it's interesting that it has African origins. When I was playing it, one of the things you may have noticed is one of the strings on the banjo is a little bit smaller, and that's what's known as the drone string. And so that actually was invented in Africa. And there's instruments like the akonting that I'll talk about here in a minute that still use that type of technology. So today you can still get a Senegal, the Gambia, Mali, and see people play kind of the original form of the instrument.
Sorry, Kevin, I just wanted to let you know, you can share your screen with the Zoom folks if you wanted to. I gave you the ability to share.
Oh, are they not able to see it?
I don't think they moved. Probably it's not too clear with the screen behind them.
Oh, okay. Let me see here. Sorry about that. Let me just get into Zoom for a minute and share. Sorry about that, folks. So let me go ahead and share that with you. Okay. All right. So hopefully everybody can see that. All right. So when people in Africa were captured and sent to the Americas, basically they went to the West Indies first. And so this kind of shows the map. And eventually a lot of people who ended up in the United States, that was their first stop, was the West Indies during the slave trade. So this is the first known painting or image of a banjo. It's from a painting called The Old Plantation that came out in around 1800. But in this picture, you can see somebody playing a banjo over here. And this is actually what I would call a hybrid banjo. It uses many of the things from earlier African instruments like the akonting from the Gambia, but also, if you notice, it has like a fretboard and European tuning pegs. And so this is kind of a hybrid of European and kind of African technology. But it's interesting to look at this picture. So Africans who were captured and survived the Middle Passage, they first landed in the West Indies, and they started to fashion banjos out of gourds that they found in that particular area. So think about it. It's not like on these ships, there was like a luggage department, right? It's like nobody brought over an instrument from Africa. So they had to basically build these things themselves when they came to the New World. And so that is interesting to me as a musician, because it's like, how much do you have to love music to go through all of that and still want to like take the time to put together an instrument? But that's really how the banjo came to the United States. And so one of the interesting things, I mentioned that the banjos were made out of gourds, and they still are in some parts of Africa. But the symbol of the gourd was used during the Underground Railroad. So escaped slaves were taught to follow the dipping gourd, which is kind of, they use a gourd for water in wells. And so if you looked in the sky and saw the Big Dipper, you can find the Little Dipper, you can find the North Star. And the North Star really doesn't change much in the sky. And so it's always something pointing north. And so it was a symbol basically that helped people find the road to freedom through the North. Also, the North Star was the name of Frederick Douglass's abolitionist newspaper. Okay, so the akonting is still played in places like the Gambia and Senegal and so forth. And so you can kind of see, compared to the instrument I was just playing, it looks very similar to a modern banjo, right? So it's basically a skin put over a gourd, so it has like a drum, which amplifies the sound, and then you have strings that are stretched over it. This instrument, you'll notice that the neck looks a lot different, but it also has the drone string that we see in modern banjo. Okay, back to this picture again. Thomas Jefferson was a musician. He played the violin. His wife, Martha, played the harpsichord, and so did his daughter, I believe. And you can still see those at Monticello. But he wrote in his notes on the state of Virginia, the instrument proper to them is the banjar, which they brought hither from Africa. So even Thomas Jefferson was interested in the music that he was hearing among the slave people that were at Monticello. One of the origins of the word banjo is thought to come from the capital of the Gambia, which is Banjul, which sounds kind of similar to banjo. And so, and that actually means string in the language of the Mandinka people. And so stringed instruments really have a long history. They came originally from China and India, and actually the word tar in Sanskrit means string. So like you think of the guitar, or the sitar, an Indian instrument. That's where it kind of started. And then you had traders, basically Arab traders that came to Africa pretty early on that brought stringed instruments. Now, one of the things, we don't really know what banjo music sounded like in the beginnings of the United States, the colonial period, because music wasn't recorded, it wasn't written down. I was playing a song earlier by Paradisi, which was written in 1750, and that's probably something that Thomas Jefferson probably was familiar with that song, but we know how that song sounds because it was written down. So sadly, a lot of music, early banjo music is lost to us, essentially. All right, so when did white people start adapting the banjo? Well, it wasn't until much later. Really, the banjo was played exclusively by enslaved people, probably for at least the first 100 years of the United States. But around 1830, you began to see white musicians playing the banjo, and the main type of entertainment where you saw this was the minstrel show. And so these were performers, white performers, who performed in blackface. They used burnt cork and tried to appear like they were black. And these shows were widely popular, not just in the South, but also in the North. Minstrel shows even went to London, Paris, and Australia. So it was kind of a popular type of entertainment, although it really made fun, I think, of Black people and drew on a lot of, stereotypes and things. And so that's why I said, while it's one of the most shameful parts of American history, it did kind of popularize the banjo at a popular culture kind of level, particularly among white people. One of the first musicians in the minstrel period was somebody by the name of Thomas Wright. He was known as kind of the father of this genre. And he was a blackface performer who performed the banjo in a style that kind of imitated Black musicians, but often in demeaning ways. And his most famous character was a character named Jim Crow, which you've probably heard that word before. So that became a name for segregation laws throughout the South, later in the United States. This is also a racial slur. So that's where the origin of that name came from. Interestingly, there was a song during that period called Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, and it was later turned into Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. That was actually the state song for the Commonwealth of Virginia until 1997, when somebody decided that the lyrics had racist overtones, and so they got rid of it as a state song of Virginia. But it's interesting that it lasted all the way till 1907, and it kind of has its origins in this earlier period. All right, the banjo kind of evolved later in American history. It changed a lot. Like the instrument that I have before me, I'll kind of grab it right here. You'll notice it's changed quite a bit, right? Instead of, a skin over the drum part, it's a synthetic skin now. There's still the drone string here, but this one has a lot of bells and whistles that I'll talk about later. It has a dobro resonator, a system in it that I'll talk about. But one of the things that happened is when banjos started to get manufactured at a big level, mostly after the Civil War, most of the banjos were built in northern factories, which is interesting. And so they weren't really Southern instruments, but a lot of Black musicians started to play the banjo in early ragtime and early jazz music. And so one of the things about the banjo, why it was popular in Dixieland jazz, is it's a loud instrument. If you don't believe me, you can ask my neighbors, because I spent most of COVID trying to learn this damn thing, how to play it. It's loud, and it will cut through, trumpets, trombones, drums, and that's one of the reasons why it was used in early jazz, because the electric guitar had not been invented yet. Interestingly, Black musicians who played jazz on the banjo did not like the drone string. They hated it, so they would just get rid of it. And that led to the creation of the four-string banjo, which you hear a lot of times in Dixieland music. And it wasn't really until the 1930s when the electric guitar was invented that you saw, people stop using banjos and then go on to the electric guitar. So here's an early picture, King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, New Orleans, 1923. On the trumpet, you'll see a young Louis Armstrong playing trumpet in this band. So he's one of the founding, people in jazz. And you'll notice instead of an electric guitar, they had a banjo player. So a lot of that sound came from the banjo being played. All right, so how do we get to bluegrass music? Well, there's a lot of history there, kind of looking at the influence of record companies and also other cultures, immigrants. And so as the United States got a little bit older, more and more people immigrated here. And one group of people were the Scots-Irish. That's kind of my people who came and settled in Appalachia. And they've often, had neighbors who were Black musicians. And so many of these white musicians learned how to play the banjo and other instruments from Black musicians. A lot of this style, one of the reasons I called my presentation Hiding in Plain Sight, I can definitely hear, the influence of Black musicians on everything when I listen to bluegrass songs. It's really like sped up blues in a lot of ways. But it's interesting how those immigrants ended up adopting the banjo and started working it in to their own traditional Scots-Irish music. Other immigrants brought other changes. So most bluegrass bands have a mandolin player in it. So people from Europe, Italy in particular, brought the mandolin. The dobro, this banjo here has a dobro system. It's a resonator system where basically the sound bounces around and then some metal here, and it makes the banjo kind of heavy. That was actually created by some Eastern European brothers from Slovakia. The name dobro actually comes from the Depraya brothers. Do was the first part of their name, and then bro, meaning brother. So that's where the name came from. But if it was not for immigrants, we probably would not see bluegrass and country music. We wouldn't hear it the way that we would hear it today, because really all of those influences helped to shape the music. But around in the late 1920s and early 1930s, record companies decided, well, hey, let's start marketing old-timey banjo music, string music to white audiences, and we're gonna do kind of like country blues by Black artists. We're gonna market that to Black audiences. So that's where the split really happened between the music. So record companies began marketing what was called hillbilly music to white audience, and then rural blues music to Black audiences. So this kind of led to that separation. Country blues and jazz kind of went one way, bluegrass and country music went another way. So it's hard to, find early recordings of Black musicians. Many were not recorded, and a lot of Black musicians during the Great Migration traveled to northern urban centers like Chicago and recorded like with the Chess Brothers and other stuff. So really the country blues that they often played on instruments like the banjo and guitar switched later to like electric guitar, became more like what the type of blues that we listen to today. All right, so I've got a couple. Charlie Poole was an early 1920s white banjo player. Blind Lemon Jefferson was a Black blues artist. So these are just kind of ways they would market people to these separate audiences. All right, then also in the 30s, Virginia has a big role in the development of bluegrass and country music. So and pre-country Appalachia, we had people like the Carter family. Mabel Carter is shown playing the guitar here in the picture. She's probably like, I guess not the father, but the mother of bluegrass guitar. Her style of flat picking has influenced everybody to this day. And so that started all the way in Bristol, Virginia, a number of back in the 1930s. But their records sold well. They were very much steeped in kind of like bluegrass, old-timey string music. And so that's, they also were influential in terms of kind of making the split from bluegrass and old-time string music to what we know as country music today, more mainstream country music, because a lot of their songs were recorded later by other artists and so. All right. Then later in the 30s and the 1940s, as we know, radio was the medium of choice. And so there were a lot of bluegrass shows that were popular, particularly in the South. And so we had like the Grand Ole Opry was a powerful 50,000 watt radio station in Nashville that broadcasts bluegrass and country all over the South. And so it became a very popular type of entertainment for a lot of people who didn't have televisions yet, but they would tune in with the radio to listen to the music. And so that really helped spread, I guess, the love and the influence of bluegrass music, to a wider audience. But interestingly, at the time, the bands that you would hear would be people like Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. Earl Scruggs was a banjo player from North Carolina. It's probably one of the most famous white bluegrass players from this era. But the Stanley Brothers, they were from Virginia. There were a lot of people in this region who played bluegrass, but they tended to be white musicians. Same thing with the white country musicians like Patsy Cline, who was from Winchester, Virginia. They all kind of played this music. And by this time, you would think that really white people had invented this genre of music, because anything that had to do with black musicians was basically kind of taken out of it, right? Including the instrument itself that would not have existed without, the African influence. And this is I'm old now. I've got my 60th birthday next Friday. So, but when I was a kid, I remember watching, these shows on television. I don't know if a lot of you are probably too young to remember the Beverly Hillbillies or the Andy Griffith Show, but they're still on reruns on cable television. And so those shows actually featured, Beverly Hillbillies featured Flatt and Scruggs, which was a popular bluegrass band at the time. And the Andy Griffith Show featured a band called the Darlings, which they played a song called Dooley, which I played just at the beginning of the presentation. So I remember hearing that song back when I was a kid. Okay, moving along. In the late 50s and 1960s, you saw a big interest in bluegrass and folk music, particularly in New York. And so even today, if you see banjo players like Tony Triska, Bela Fleck, and many others, they're all from New York. So it's like, how did that happen? You would think they would be from the South somewhere. But Greenwich Village was kind of like a mecca for banjo players in a lot of ways. And so it really attracted kind of a whole new scene, particularly a lot of hippies who ended up playing banjo. And so it's weird when I go to bluegrass concerts today, it's a weird mix of an audience. There's kind of like people I think that I'd see at a Trump rally next to a lot of baked out hippies, in tie dye. And now a lot more young people are getting interested in it. So it's no longer a music for older people. There's a lot of people in their 20s now who are following bluegrass. And some of the biggest artists right now, people like, Billy Strings and others, they're all young artists. And so there's been like a resurgence. So it kind of goes back and forth in waves. In the 70s, probably one of the most famous pop culture texts and we'll look at it later from kind of a pop culture perspective, was the movie Deliverance, which I remember watching that in the 70s. And there's a famous scene that I'll show you here called Dueling Banjos. But the soundtrack for that movie led to a huge rise in the popularity of bluegrass music. Again, you didn't see any black basses playing this type of music, right? Also in the 90s, a movie with George Clooney, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, featured a lot of bluegrass music. And so you saw yet another resurgence. So it seems like this type of music has been kind of regurgitated a number of times in different forms. All right, so I wanted to show you, I think I have here, hopefully you guys will be able to see this. I have all these, there's my dueling banjos. I'm gonna play this scene for you here. Hopefully you guys can see it out there in Zoom land.
Still showing them the PowerPoint.
Can you see it?
It's on the PowerPoint.
It's in the PowerPoint. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and play it and they can always, Whoops. So these are a bunch of white businessmen from Atlanta who decided to take a canoe trip down a river in Georgia. And they have a guy who plays guitar.
They can't see it on the,
Oh, okay, share it real quick. Sorry. I have to do this with all the videos. Okay, not a problem. I got it. Okay, share. Sorry, folks out there. I'll
okay.
play it for you. Angelina Jolie's.
Just as a heads up, we don't have any sound online.
Yeah, I think you need to share sound. Yep.
Oh, sorry. How do I do that real quick?
Go over to
When
where
you
it's-
go to share, it also has a place to click.
Share sound. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, folks. All right, I got it now. All right.
Good. No, ask him about his hand.
I don't think you understood me. I want to get some drivers to drive this car and that car down to Aintree. Drivers, you understand?
You might get a driver, brothers.
Who?
The driver, brothers.
Where do they live?
They live back over that way. $4.99.
Right.
Talk about genetic deficiencies. Isn't that pitiful? Who's picking the manger here?
Come on, I'm with you. I've gotten lost in that song a few times. So here, I'm gonna just get out of that for a second, if everyone can see. All right, let me just bring up my slides again. So, an interesting thing about this particular scene. I'm sorry, is it still on the video? Do I need to stop sharing?
Switch.
Sorry.
Are you gonna go back to the?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
You can probably just share your main screen up there, the top one.
Oh, this one here. Okay, yes, let me do that. Sorry, folks, it's kind of hard to. All right, so one of the things I was gonna say with this, this is one of the most famous, bluegrass scenes that you'll ever find. Actually, I remember watching this scene when I was a kid, and that really got me interested in the banjo. I didn't start playing the banjo until I was 55, I think, so it took a long time. But I always liked the banjo because of that particular movie. And going back kind of when I was doing my research for this talk, it was interesting to kind of look back at Deliverance because I've read the book as well. And there's a lot of themes in that book that are really relevant from like a pop culture stance today. I was just telling Richard before the presentation that one theme is that in the book and in the movie is that suburban life is making men weak. It's making them, less of a man in some way. And so we need to go out there and kind of like do macho stuff and recapture our masculinity. So it's really, we're seeing that type of theme again with the rhetoric of people like Josh Hawley and others, in modern politics who've kind of, talked about that thing. And other things about this scene that really interested me, the kid who was playing the banjo, he didn't have any type of developmental disability or intellectual disability. He was actually a local high school student in Georgia where they filmed the movie, and they cast him because he had that inbred hillbilly look, which is kind of interesting. But he actually didn't play the banjo. They had a special shirt where they put a real banjo player's arms through the sleeves of the shirt and were playing the banjo. And the two people who actually played the song were actually off screen. One of the interesting themes about this from this movie is, and I hear this a lot, particularly when I play, clubs for country audiences and that sort of stuff. When I talk about country music and even bluegrass in general, they'll say, oh, well, that's a good example of like common sense, country folks smarts. People have really good smarts. They may be poor. They may not have a lot of other stuff going to them, but look at the kid in Deliverance. He was like a genius on the banjo, even though he didn't have anything else going for him. And so I hear that sort of theme a lot. But the interesting thing, when you look at the actual people who played dueling banjos, that song, this is really interesting. It was actually two Jewish men from New York City who were Juilliard trained musicians, and also they were hippies, like ultra liberal hippies. So here it is, the hillbilly anthem, Dueling Banjos, was actually written and performed in the movie by two Jewish men from New York City who were Juilliard trained. And so it's really interesting. So if you look, I have this clip here by Eric Weisberg and Steve Mandel. I'm going to try to share it with you
You're
here.
sharing it. It's still sharing.
Oh, it's still sharing. Okay.
Share your entire screen.
Oh, perfect. All right.
Go
So,
back to the top one.
oh, so I don't have to
Yeah,
I
you don't
click
have to.
out of this. Okay, sorry.
No, click.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, yep, that one right there. If you share that screen.
The
you don't
screen
have-
here.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So share. I didn't realize so many people are going to be joining by, but anyway, here's the real guys who, who did this song. Oh, that's loud. You're all skipping all of it. Anyway, Anyway, I'm going to stop that for a second. So yeah, Eric Weisberg was a really great banjo player. He just died a couple of years ago, but he went on to play on a lot of Simon and Garfunkel records. I think he's also on Billy Joel's Piano Man playing guitar. So he was kind of a famous, New York session musician. But it's interesting because when you talk to a lot of bluegrass and country music folks, there is a lot of, I think, still a lot of racism and among fans of that type of music sometimes. And so a lot of them don't really even acknowledge that there were Black people who kind of created this music, but also they don't really look at necessarily other minorities' contributions. So I think it's interesting that the hillbilly anthem was actually created by liberal hippies, essentially. So that's why I have this meme here about pulling back the curtain. All right, so just moving along, one of the things I find interesting about popular culture is this idea of who owns certain texts, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about reclamation of bluegrass and country music spaces. So last spring, I remember when Cowboy Carter, the Beyonce album came out, a lot of critics were like, what right does she have to like venture into the country music genre? And it's interesting because a lot of the early banjo players are actually women. And so Black women have had a role in what we now know as bluegrass and country music very early on. And yet that's almost been forgotten. So I applaud Beyonce for, moving into that space. Really, I find a lot of modern country music kind of boring. I can't tell Ricky Van Paisley from the next guy. I listen to a lot of older country music and bluegrass music. So to me, I feel like country music has gotten stale in recent years, mainly because a lot of the soul of the music has been taken out. And so a lot of the Black influence, Black musician influence, I think, has been taken out in a lot of ways. And so for me, it's really exciting to kind of see Beyonce and others move into that space. Sure, they may not be playing in the most traditional sense, but they're basically reinventing it, coming up with new ideas and reclaiming that space. So I thought it was a little bit shocking in some ways that, people, the critics were so tough against her. And so there's other artists as well. One person in the middle here, Rhiannon Giddens, she's a Black woman who has kind of reclaimed traditional banjo. I saw her last fall when she came here to Mason at the Performing Arts Center. She played to a packed audience, but I'll talk a little bit and maybe show you a video here if we have some time. So one of the things I wanted to say is, when you look at other genres of American music, you tend to see musicians acknowledging the Black roots of music, right? There's kind of this understanding that Black people really shaped not just bluegrass and country music, but all genres of American music have an influence, African-American influence. So whether you're talking about Benny Goodman, he brought in Lionel Hampton and Teddy Powell that you see here in the picture. He was one of the first jazz artists to have an integrated band. And apparently it was tough even getting him to accept that initially, but the musicians were so good, he ended up adding them to the band. Elvis recorded with people like B.B. King at Sun Records. The Beatles idolized, Little Richard, who's one of my favorite Black artists from the rock and roll era. The Rolling Stones idolized Muddy Waters, George Thorogood with Bo Diddley. And of course, the Beastie Boys paid their homage to Run DMC when you're looking at kind of rap music and other forms of music. So yeah, for me, I've played a lot of different types of music. So bluegrass is kind of a new one for me, but in other bands I played a lot of blues and jazz and other types of things. And I've always kind of idolized a lot of Black musicians. I've actually met two of the people you see. I've met Little Richard and Bo Diddley. So I got to open up for both of those artists, which was great. We played with Little Richard in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and our singer had his hotel room right next to Little Richard's room. So we all went into his room and we were listening to in the wall. We wanted to see if we could hear him or something, but we got to meet him later, which was kind of cool. But yeah, I think, most musicians recognize the contributions of Black musicians. And in a lot of cases, we put people up on a pedestal. Not so much so in the country and bluegrass genres, right? That's why I said, chirp. You don't hear many people, acknowledging the African-American roots in that genre, even though to me, they're about as visible as they can get. That's why I called the talk Hiding in Plain Sight. And so, oh yeah, did you have a question?
Oh, I was typing. I hope I wasn't coming off as rude. I was literally typing in notes the entire time. And before I have to head out, I wanted to type to kind of ask a question based upon everything I was able to gather in. You kind of answered one of my questions too. I put in that there seems to be an interesting hegemony between the banjo's origins with the African diaspora, or an African continent, and its co-optation by white people, as well as a class hegemony between what is considered a stereotypically poor white demographic and the more suburban, wealthier white owners and practitioners of the popular forms of bluegrass. And then you already addressed one of my things, that bluegrass, similar to hip hop, seems to be another Black artifact that was a victim of capitalism and colonialism. You talked about country music's dilution into a soulless, non-confrontational product thanks to capitalism. I've had students, one of my students loves like a plethora of genres, and they talked about like how they can't really listen to modern country music because it lacks that like soul, that
Exactly.
angst that like it had like in the last century. And there seems to be, starting to like connect like colonialism's relationship with pop culture and possibly like a colonialist, although it's an obvious capitalist relationship to pop culture, now just starting to expand it. And what I put down was that like Black people, it seems that Black people's perpetual place in pop culture seems to be in like the forever slave role, in that like Black people can be the ones creating or doing I'm trying to think of the term, I'm trying to think of the word for it, but like we're doing all the labor while not necessarily profiting off of it. And when we do profit off of it, it's emulating the same people who exploited our own work as well. So there seems to be like, and there seems to be this popular sentiment like Black people need to be, like this unconscious sentiment that Black people need to be slaving and creating the culture that we can then co-opt and make a lot more acceptable or perfected, for instance, I guess.
I love everything he said. I mean, I think there's so many examples of that. And just while I have this slide up, George Thorogood, one of his big hits was a song that he didn't write, One Bourbon, One Scotch, One Beer. That was a song that was written in the 40s by a Black artist by the name of Amos Milburn, who kind of died poor and alcoholism and a lot of other stuff. He had a really bad life toward the end. And George Thorogood made probably millions off of, recording that song. The original song is way better if you listen to the Amos Milburn version, but a lot of people don't even know who Amos Milburn is today. Check him out if you ever have a chance. A lot of the songs that you heard the Beatles do, the Stones, a lot of rock artists really come from like the 1940s and 50s jump blues era, which is really interesting. But yes, I agree. It seems like a lot of Black musicians do the labor, they put in the creativity, and then a lot of times the white artists get the fame and fortune and that sort of thing. And so that's an ongoing story, I think, in American music. All right, so I just wanted to show, I don't have time to show all these videos, but I wanted to show a little bit of Rhiannon Giddens, who I mentioned, who is kind of reclaiming the banjo, and she plays an older style of banjo called clawhammer style. So before they had finger picks, people would just play with their fingers, and the strings are different, the banjos are different. This is kind of a banjo that was more like a 1800s banjo that you'll hear her playing here. And let me just make sure I can share the screen with everybody. So we are sharing. Okay, so I can just click out of it now. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit from her, but we really don't know, as I said, what early banjo music sounded like, but we know a little bit about that. It was played in a clawhammer style, and probably similar to what she's trying to recreate here. So this is kind of her recreation of like old timey Black banjo playing, basically. And so she's a great artist if you ever get a chance to see her. Sorry, let me hit play.
Julie, oh Julie, won't you run? 'Cause I see down yonder the soldiers have come. Julie, oh Julie, can't you see that them devils have come to take you far from me? Mistress, oh mistress, I won't run, 'cause I see down yonder the soldiers have come. Mistress, oh mistress, I do see, and and I'll stay right here till they come for me.
I think in the interest of time, I might stop this. Sorry about that. Definitely check out that video and more of her stuff. One thing I love about Rhiannon Giddens is she can play bluegrass banjo like the best of them, right? She's a great player, but she's really embraced this earlier style of banjo, the clawhammer style, and really is trying to create that and really connect back to the Black roots of banjo playing, which is great. But she's a rarity out there, right? Most people who listen to bluegrass and country music are probably even unaware of a lot of these influences. And so before I open it up to questions here, in conclusion, I think the influence of African-American musicians on American music, all genres, is pretty much undeniable. I hear it every day in almost every type of music that I listen to. I can hear, oh, that's coming from blues, that's coming from Black jazz musicians, this is coming from, some of these earlier influences. And so I think we just need to recognize that. But we all know that we're living in a time when many politicians are kind of saying, oh, let's not teach the uncomfortable history where we have to talk about slavery or any of these things. Certainly, I don't think, many people now in our state government might want people to know about the minstrel song that was used, as our state song for a long time in Virginia. But those are the sort of things that the more that I read African-American history, the more I learn and the more I want to know. That's the history that I didn't learn in school. And so when my wife's father died, he had thousands of US history books. So I inherited all of those, and he had a lot on African-American history. And so the more I read, the more I realized, wow, this is the stuff I want to know about. So and it's really interesting as a musician just to go back and take a look at the history, because it really gives you an appreciation. Every time I play this thing, I'm kind of in awe of it, just how far this instrument has traveled and all the different genres of music that it's influenced. So I think when you look at the story of American music, it's a clear example of how Black Americans, immigrants, and other minorities played a crucial role in terms of contributing to it. But those narratives are not always talked about. Instead, we hear, oh, it's white people's music. They're the ones who created it or invented it, when in fact, that's not true at all. And so that's one of the things I find fascinating about American music. And I really now respect the banjo more. The more I play it, the more I kind of appreciate where it came from, just knowing more about the history. And so one of my dreams someday is to go to Africa and bring the banjo with me. And Bela Fleck, who's a famous banjo player that I talked about, he actually has a documentary where he did that and goes to the Gambia and to Senegal and other places and plays with local African musicians. And it's amazing to hear how well the banjo fits in with African music, because it came from African music essentially. And really when you watch that documentary, you realize, just how much it is an African instrument, and it's just been co-opted, I suppose, by white musicians. All right, so that being said, I'm gonna say thank you for listening and open it up for Q&A. Hopefully I didn't talk too long here. I know we had a few technical problems, so.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wright. Oh, yeah, the floor is open for questions.
I'll look at the chat here, so.
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't have a question, but I just thought it was interesting. When I was in Japan, there's this whole big, they're groups very into American culture, and there were a bunch of people that played the banjo.
Yeah.
And it was really fun just to see them play the really good, really well actually. They're like, yeah, America, and they just started playing the banjo, and I was like, okay, thank you. It was a tribute.
Yeah, it's really, the banjo, as far as an instrument or text, as I was playing before the presentation, I was playing that classical piece. And, so really you could play higher culture art, if you look at classical music in that way. You can play Bach. Whoops, I can't do it today. That kind of stuff. But I was playing, but really that's kind of like what white person's music was, particularly, in the beginning of this country. And so, that was what people like Thomas Jefferson and others were playing. But when I hear banjo music, particularly bluegrass, I really can hear the blues in there a lot. A lot of ideas, really kind of come from blues. And so just from a musical standpoint, blues riffs are something that you don't hear a lot in classical music. They usually use what are known as pentatonic scales, or major and minor pentatonic scales. So all of us probably have heard that, like the bluesy sound like. Um, those are all blues riffs, pentatonic scales. A lot of bluegrass is just playing really fast blues licks over kind of like a country beat. But even that beat, that all that kind of stuff comes from African American music as well, that the rhythmic part of it. And so I hear it every day in music, but it's really kind of interesting to hear those ideas. So a lot of banjo music will have that kind of mournful sound to it, because it's playing a lot of bluesy types of scales. And so that's one of the things I really like about the instrument, is you can kind of add those sort of musical influences. But without Black people, basically, those types of riffs and music would not exist.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Oh Brother Where Art Thou movie, because that was one of the things that was coming to mind as you were going through the conversation. I started to think about that movie and how, or when they get into the musical renditions and everything, and they're the Soggy Bottom Boys,
Right.
that their instrument player is a Black man.
Right.
So it makes me wonder, just in regards to how much research did they commit to creating that film, thinking about the legacy of bluegrass music and where the instrumentation came from, because it plays on the legend of Robert Johnson and everything.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So when you start talking about that, it really made me wonder how much they got into thinking about the legacy and the history that may have been overlooked, and trying to embed that in the film.
Yeah, and basically the people who did the soundtrack for that movie was Alison Krauss and Union Station. So they're pretty seasoned bluegrass musicians. Of course, they're all white, right? So, but I think they know enough, I think, about the Black origins of bluegrass, because they've been playing that type of music for a long time. But yeah, it's interesting that they kind of brought in the Robert Johnson story. For those people who don't know, Robert Johnson was a Black blues player, and he played the guitar so well that a lot of people thought that he had sold himself to the devil, and so, or his soul to the devil, basically. And so there was a movie called Crossroads, which is about how he went down to the crossroads. He has a song called Crossroads. Supposedly sold his soul to the devil, so he can, play the guitar so well. So that was part of the Oh Brother Where Art Thou movie. So that was kind of a blues legend story or narrative that got put into that particular movie. So it's interesting how you're starting to see some of it slip in a little bit, but it's interesting. All right, other questions? I see there's a hand raised. Go ahead. I can't see who's.
Hi. Yeah, that's me. So I just want to speak a little bit about the Robert Johnson story. What's interesting is that in understanding traditional African religion, often the deities within them were demonized. And so the story is not so much that he went and made a deal with the devil, is that he went and made an offer to Eshu. Eshu, the guardian of the crossroad, known by Legba, the voodoo tradition. And so when we think about sharing pieces about, it's important to share perspectives. So he was not necessarily making a deal with the devil, but it was understood, and it was what survived in traditional, in enslaved places where people carried on their traditions. And so it's one of the things that we have to think about when we think about other traditions and how Christianity often demonizes them. And so the story of Robert Johnson is much more than he made a deal. I just want to put that in there.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think most people, historians, he was gone for a certain period of time where he probably practiced a lot, and that's what led to it. So he had kind of a rough life too, in some ways, but it's interesting how that legend kind of developed. There's probably not a lot of truth to it, but those are the sort of things that become like part of folklore.
Well, yeah. It's funny how folklore makes its way into mainstream popular culture in regards to the stories and the growth of the story.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even when I was talking about the dipping gourd, the follow the dipping gourd, that was actually a Black folk song that was sung during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And so, it's interesting how some of these stories and things from earlier in American history become part sometimes of different songs and music. And so, but a lot of people don't really recognize that history because I don't think we do a good job in our schools necessarily of teaching all this type of history. I think a lot of stuff gets whitewashed and you don't really hear the full story.
So you mentioned that earlier in terms of, if I heard you correctly, they used the gourds and the dipping gourds sometimes to create the original or make banjos.
Correct.
Great instruments. So that, to me, that was kind of like thinking about how nowadays we have people using steel drums or, trash cans or things of that nature. They just found whatever they could to
Yeah,
recreate what they knew or what had been in their, native homeland at some point.
right. And that's exactly what happened with the banjo. I said, it's just, I can't imagine like being captured, taking a horrible voyage across the ocean and then even wanting to like build an instrument. But I think we know that at least in African music, the banjo, the conting before the banjo basically had a lot of spiritual significance. So it was almost like a spiritual, or a way to express spiritual, emotions, singing and that sort of stuff and playing the banjo. And so a lot of that might have been the motivation behind the musicians, like, taking the time to build a banjo. I can't imagine building a banjo like this one. You need some pretty fancy equipment, but even to build one out of a gourd and some, other materials that they use, that's pretty amazing. And the fact that that culture has survived for so long despite all of these disruptions to it. It's pretty amazing that that music still kind of lives on and music that we hear every day. All right. Any other questions from the? I've worn you out, I guess. All right. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you so much for joining us today. I apologize for any technical issues, but hopefully you had a good time and learned a little bit about history and also a little bit about music. And of course, I'm always happy to talk more about it to folks at another time. It's been great today to be able to kind of wear my pop culture researcher hat for a minute and talk about these issues because I don't really do this type of research, but I've always appreciated it just because I think it is very important sometimes to pull back the curtain and see the structures and everything, the influences that kind of change these popular culture texts and what we think about them.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate you sharing it with us, and it goes along with the theme that we have for this year, which is reimagining, reasserting, and resistance through popular culture. And so I think that you really captured that with the demonstration of instruments and the growth and evolution of music and how African Americans and African culture has played into mainstream without us even really knowing.
Yeah,
Thank
absolutely.
you. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everybody.
And folks in Zoom land, we are going to stop the video and stop recording. We appreciate you joining
Oh, hey,
us.
Gary.
Great talk. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Hopefully you could hear everything okay. It's kind of, I'm not used to playing and talking, so.
You did
I
great.
think you should play your banjo in all your classes, man.
I talk about some of this stuff like in the media theory class. I don't bring in a banjo, but I've talked about, a lot of these kind of issues and things. So it's fun because I think most media classes they spend a lot of time on television and, other types of media. But for me, I think music is a really fascinating thing to look at. So
I'll jam with you with my kazoo.
anytime.
It's like the Jimmy Fallon band when he starts playing with the band at the end.
Oh, right. No, that's great stuff. So, but yeah, I gotta like figure out a way to play classic rock, like that kind of stuff. You can always do it. Anyway, thanks everybody.